It's the dead of winter 20,000 years ago. The food ran out 6 weeks ago. Someone in the group is dying slowly, too weak to hunt, too weak to walk, and everyone else is quietly doing the math on how many days that changes for the rest of them. This isn't fiction. This happened constantly. We like to tell ourselves ancient winters were survived through grit, toughness, thick furs, and strong wills. And sure, that's part of it. But it's the comfortable part, the part that fits neatly into a documentary voiceover. What actually kept small hunter-gatherer bands alive through months of sub-zero starvation involved decisions that modern morality doesn't have a category for. Not because ancient humans were crueler than us, because the math they were working with left almost no room for anything else. Let's go. First, let's talk about calories, because everything else in this video only makes sense once you understand the brutal accounting involved. A human body burns roughly 1,800 to 2,400 calories a day just existing. In an Ice Age winter with no stored grain, no greenhouse vegetables, no supply chain, that number had to come from somewhere, and for weeks at a time, it often came from nowhere. Archaeologists studying skeletal remains from harsh glacial period sites have found something consistent across unrelated populations on different continents. Seasonal stress markers in bone growth, essentially scars left behind by periods of near starvation, repeating year after year in the same individuals. Winter wasn't a season you got through. It was a recurring emergency your body physically remembered. Second, and this is where it gets uncomfortable, triage wasn't hypothetical. It was policy. Ethnographic studies of more recent hunter-gatherer and subarctic societies document something researchers are careful and precise about when they describe it. In the most extreme famine conditions, elderly members of a group sometimes chose or were expected to stop eating so that children and hunters could survive on the remaining food. Not violence, not abandonment in the dramatic sense movies portray it. A quiet, agreed-upon math problem solved by the people it affected most. The group's survival odds went up. One person's went to zero. That trade was not made lightly, and it wasn't made often, but it was made. The anthropologists describe it less as cruelty and more as the oldest form of resource allocation there is. Third, infanticide, specifically the deliberate non-survival of infants during resource crises, appears in the anthropological record with a consistency that's hard to look away from once you see it. Researchers studying birth spacing in ancient foraging populations have found evidence that group survival depended on mothers nursing one child at a time for years, and that a second birth arriving too soon, especially during a bad winter, created an impossible resource conflict. This wasn't random tragedy. It was, in the coldest possible sense, a structural feature of how small, mobile populations regulated themselves against an environment that offered zero flexibility. It's one of the parts of ancient life left out of the prehistoric athletes with stone tools narrative because it doesn't fit the story we want to tell about our ancestors. But leaving it out doesn't make it less true. Fourth, there's cannibalism, and this is the one people expect, but usually for the wrong reasons. Sites like Gough's cave in England, dated to around 15,000 years ago, show human bones with cut marks nearly identical to how animal bones from the same period were butchered. Not ritual mutilation, butchery. Researchers point to survival cannibalism during catastrophic resource failure as the most consistent explanation, a documented, repeating strategy that shows up independently across Ice Age populations with no contact with each other. When the alternative was extinction, the taboo bent. It didn't happen constantly, but it happened enough in enough unconnected places that researchers no longer treat it as an outlier. They treat it as a pattern. Fifth, and less visceral, but just as revealing. Fat prioritization wasn't preference. It was hierarchy enforced by necessity. When a large kill happened in the depths of the winter, order in which a group consumed it wasn't random. Marrow and organ fat went first, to whoever was weakest, not strongest. Researchers analyzing butchery patterns at cold season kill sites have found bones cracked and stripped in ways that suggest the group deliberately extracted every last calorie of fat before touching the muscle meat, because fat, not protein, is what a starving body actually needs to keep basic functions running. There's a documented condition, sometimes called rabbit starvation, where a person eating only lean meat can develop malnutrition even while consuming enough calories. Ancient groups understood this instinctively, long before anyone had a word for metabolism, which tells you something about how finely tuned survival knowledge had to become just to make it from November to April. There's also a quieter version of all this that doesn't involve a single dramatic moment, and it might be the darkest one precisely because that wasn't a decision at all. Chronic seasonal undernutrition suppressed fertility across many ancient populations almost automatically. The female body, under sustained caloric stress, simply stops ovulating reliably. No one chose this. No one debated it around a fire. It happened at a hormonal level. Invisibly, generation after generation, it functioned as a built-in population brake, preventing groups from adding mouths they couldn't feed during the worst years. Some researchers studying seasonal birth patterns in pre-agricultural societies have pointed to exactly this mechanism to explain why birth rates in many ancient populations cluster so tightly around specific times of year. The body was making triage decisions the mind never had to. Now, before this starts sounding like ancient humans were simply monstrous, let's be honest about something, because leaving this part out would be irresponsible. Every one of these behaviors clusters around genuine catastrophic conditions, multi-year climate shifts, failed migrations, unusually brutal ice age winters that pushed populations past every buffer they had. These weren't casual decisions. They were last resort decisions made by people who, in every other season, shared food generously, cared for their sick, and raised children collectively with a level of cooperation that modern nuclear families would struggle to match. The same archaeological sites that show survival cannibalism also show healed bone fractures, evidence of injured group members being cared for, fed, and kept alive for months or years despite contributing nothing to the hunt. These weren't people who valued life less than we do. They were people operating so close to the edge of extinction for so many consecutive generations that the edge itself became a normal part of the calculation. And here's the part that should actually unsettle you more than any of the specific details. None of this was a design flaw. It was the mechanism. Populations that made these unbearable trade-offs when the math demanded it survived to reproduce. Populations that didn't, that held rigidly to a rule of never, under any circumstances, when the alternative was total group extinction. Those populations in the harshest winters sometimes simply didn't make it to spring. The flexibility to bend the rules under existential pressure isn't a bug in human psychology. It's an inherited feature, refined over tens of thousands of winters by ancestors who were willing to do the unbearable thing so that someone would be alive to remember them. You will probably never face a choice like that. Your winters have grocery stores and thermostats and food that doesn't run out. And a bad month means a tighter budget, not a body count. But the wiring is still in you. The same capacity for cold, rational triage under catastrophic pressure, inherited quietly from every ancestor who faced a version of that dead of winter math and chose the group over the individual or the individual over the group and lived long enough to pass that choice down. Somewhere underneath every comfortable modern instinct you have about fairness and sacrifice sits a much older calculation, one that was tested against actual extinction and refined until it worked. It's not a comfortable inheritance, but it's the one that got you here.